He closed his hand around my wrist like a judge coming down on a verdict, firm, final, as if he could clamp the thing he wanted to decide and leave the rest of me to whatever broke afterward. "I can't marry you, Maya," Lucas Alvarez said, his voice made of gravel and iron that always settled the room. "You're barren. We need sons. You know how this works." He let go with the same slow, clinical motion, as if releasing evidence. The skin at my wrist buzzed where his fingers had been, and the world split into the moment before his breath and the moment after. The latter tasted of metal and midnight and a betrayal that had the shape of a future I had already worn in my heart. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. I walked out of the Black Halos clubhouse with a suitcase that had held my dresses and the small silver fork my mother had given me the day I left home, and the hallway lights slashed at the back of my eyes like the cameras they sometimes pretended to be. Men I had known for years watched me leave, some with pity like a curtain lowered, some with faces unreadable as river stones. Lucas stood by his bike under the porch, a shadow stitched to chrome, and I understood then that the club wasn't only a brotherhood of leather and oil, it was a machine that ground lineage into law and turned women's bodies into currency for future power. I had loved a lawgiver, and he had judged me unfit. Outside, the night smelled like rain and burning rubber. My car's engine coughed awake, and I drove until the highway loosened its hold and the town light end. I found a room above a diner 3 nights later because they took cash and didn't ask questions. I learned the rhythm of neon: open, close, mop, refill coffee. I learned to make the eggs soft and to wipe my palms on my apron like hands that wanted to be cleaner than the truth. I kept my grievance tucked inside me like a small animal, quiet, hungry, because there was no use letting everyone know the holes Lucas had pointed out. The club's law had named me less. My life would be the answer to that name. The diner was on the crossroads of nowhere and somewhere, where bikers came through in waves, where I served grease-streaked plates to men who smelled of petrol and regret. It was night shift work and honest, and it let me hear my own heartbeat while I wore headphones and pretended the world could not tell my history by how I avoided mirrors. On a late Tuesday, when the autumn wind cut through the neon glow and the coffee pot hummed a steady lullaby, the bell over the diner's door clanged like a punctuation. In they came, 1 man and 5 children, a tumble of small hands and a soft scuffle of voices that made my stomach fold and remember. He shook rain from his shoulders and from a leather that had seen better decades. Jonah Reyes had a silence that was almost a song, low, steady, a voice that existed in the space between speaking and keeping a promise. He looked like a man who had been pressed by life into something useful. The lines at his mouth were carved by laughter and by the thin abrasions of doing the same hard thing for years. The kids clustered behind him like a comet tail. Miguel, 9, with a nose still bruised from a fall. Lucia, 7, who watched me with solemn curiosity. Twin toddlers who clutched a bat-eared stuffed rabbit. And smallest, a girl of 3 with a crown of unruly hair and a laugh that could break a man into pieces and put him back together for the better. They sat at the counter like a small battalion of hope and terror. They ate French fries like a ceremonial rite and argued over ketchup the way siblings do when the world expects them to have no place. Jonah watched them with a patience that softened the edges around his jaw. He asked for coffee, then more coffee. "They're hungry," he said to me without apology. "Been a long day on the road." He had that gentle thing in him, an outlaw who knew tenderness like it was a secret handshake. I handed plates, refilled drinks, wiped hands, and something unspooled that I had not allowed myself to unwind. The part of me that wanted a family, messy and loud and alive, reached toward theirs like a hand too used to being empty. I learned, in the days that followed, where Jonah lived. It was a trailer at the edge of a cluster of pines, a place that smelled of motor oil and stew and watched suns. A battered Harley leaned against a tree like a loyal dog. The children ran barefoot unless it rained, and Jonah kept a rule chart tacked by the kitchen. There were pictures on the fridge, crooked but insisted upon. A woman's face in one, smiling like a moonlit thing. When I asked about her, Jonah closed his eyes for a measure of time that meant the question had landed deep. "She left," he said finally. "Went to a place she said she'd be all right at. Came back only with a goodbye." He never raised his voice. His hurt lived quiet and deep. He had kept those kids because no one else would, because a father's promise had weight that club codes respected even when everything else did not. I had no intention of wading into other people's storms. My life was an island of small routines, each brick cemented by the knowledge that people like Lucas made rules that could never be bent to include me. But gratitude is a soft fastener. The night the twins choked on a hot dog bun and Jonah, startled and without remembering his own strength, performed a practiced slap that sent panic through me and then to relief when the children coughed and lived, after that night he came by the diner not as a customer passing through, but as a man looking for the warmth that my coffee offered like an unspoken plea. We began with soup and coffee and a careful sharing of silences. Jonah listened like a man taking inventory. When I spoke of Lucas, my words were shrapnel. He did not judge. He only asked if I was staying. The question felt dangerous. "Why are you here?" he asked one night, while Lucia traced the grain of the table with a finger like reading a map. "You don't have to stay for us," he said. It was not a rebuke. It was a gentleness so few men in that world offered. "Because I have nowhere else to go," I said. I heard how small it sounded, how much it left out, my pride, my fear, my suitcase of reasons. And I thought of Lucas at the clubhouse, mapping out futures that did not include me. Jonah's hand hovered above the table, curls of smoke from his cigarette making a halo he didn't want to confess. "Because all my roads led here the week they kicked me out," I added. I told him in fragments, how the word barren had been said like a coupon clipped from a life, how I had watched men I cared for decide what lineage mattered. His eyes narrowed, not with contempt, but with focus. "That's not right," he said. We became a patchwork of mutual usefulness. I fixed meals with a patience I had learned folding shirts and tucking grievances into small creases. Jonah fixed the bike when it coughed, teaching the twins to hold a wrench like a sword, teaching Miguel how to check tire pressure like a ritual. The kids loved me with the bracing, audacious speed only children have for people who are kind and present. They called me Auntie Maya because the word girlfriend belonged to a different world of laws and club gossip. They piled into my living room and spilled over like rivers into a valley, tracking in mud, telling secrets, claiming me in small, seismic ways. Word travels fast when it belongs to men with chrome under their fingernails. The black halos noticed. Maybe they noticed first because Jonah's club rode in the halo's shadow, and any tender thing that shone differently in the dark caught their eye. Rumors slithered. Maya Duarte, the woman Lucas discarded, was now living on a side road with the vice of another club. People in the halos murmured about loyalty and about symbols. Men who once had nodded politely at me in the clubhouse now looked at me like a loose thread in a finely woven blanket. Jonah felt it, his silence gathering a defensive flair. "They're watching," he said one evening, the kids asleep around us with the sleepy certainty of people who had been given a soft, temporary harbor. "They think they're entitled." Lucas did not waste his time with subtlety. He tightened the lines in halves, in subtler cuts. A truck that had been Jonah's regular parts supplier stopped returning calls. A prospect in Jonah's chapter got a sober podium and a reassignment to a harsher route. Once, a man with the halo's colors came to the diner and spun a story about the sanctity of bloodlines and the cost of fraternities keeping their own legacy. He laced the joke with sharpness, and the room equal parts laughed and watched me, gauging. Lucas sent word through silence and through the small bruises inflicted on Jonah's livelihood. He used the club's rules like a press that could squeeze someone until they fit the mold he favored. Jonah's hands started shaking, the way a man who has been balancing 1,000 small things begins to lose one. He would come to the diner and take off his jacket like an armor that needed mending. "If it comes down to it," he said once, leaning across the counter where the kids had left crayons and half a pancake, "I'll choose them." The sentence was simple and terrible. Choosing them meant choosing against a brotherhood that could swallow men whole. Choosing them meant making enemies of men who were used to being obeyed. It was the first time I noticed the scale of what being with Jonah might demand, more than a massive affection. It would require him to pick a family over a code, and that was a violent, sacred thing to ask. I wanted to tell him that I did not want to be someone else's rebellion, that I had been burned by the currency of bodies once and would not be a pawn twice. I wanted to tell him how Lucas's words had hollowed me, how the nights felt like a ledger where I had been found bankrupt, but that I had managed to keep breathing. Instead, I cleaned plates, watched Jonah reading fairy tales with the twins, and felt the hollow in my chest mention in a whisper that perhaps not every man who wore leather was an executioner of women. There were rivers of grief in me, but there were also unexpected tributaries of tenderness that had started to Jonah's quiet stream. Every time his thumb grazed a child's cheek with the care of someone who had learned to be soft in a world that rewards hardness, my heart did a risky little thing. The difficult thing settled into my bones like a weather pattern. If Jonah chose me, he'd be choosing a woman marked by a club's cruelty. If he did not, the children would keep the father they had in the barest sense, and I would go back to wiping counters that felt like the edge of the world. Either choice would be a kind of exile. The night a Halo's prospect parked outside Jonah's trailer and left a folded note on his bike, "No room for weakness," my chest closed like a door. The kids did not know the weight of such a sentence, only that their father walked slower, and that sometimes he kissed the top of their heads and left with a face that had been hammered flat with worry. There, in the tiny kitchen, with a pot of stew simmering and the yellow light above the table humming, Jonah asked me the first honest question. "If it comes," he said, "what do you want?" He wasn't asking of his club, or of rules, or even of lineage. He was asking the only thing that mattered. The question landed heavy and luminous. In that moment, I realized what I had been guarding. A hope that had been anonymous. A desire for a loud and messy belonging that Lucas had told me I did not qualify for. I thought of the children's hands, of the way Jonah's presence made my hands shake less when I was holding plates. I thought of the fork my mother had given me, and how small objects sometimes carry the belief that a person can be more than the sum of what others have decided about them. "I want a table that seats more than one person," I said. My voice surprised me, brave and fragile in the same breath. Jonah's smile was half sad and wholly tender, as if the idea of building that table was both his punishment and his salvation. He reached for my hand then, and the contact was not a taking but an offering. Outside, the world turned its gears, and men and colors decided what belonged to whom. Inside, for a flickering, precarious hour, we planned for a future that the Halos could not have foreseen. One built by choices, by quiet bravery, and by a gentle outlaw whose love would not be dictated by blood. We did not know then how sharp Lucas could be when offended, or how he would weaponize the very codes that had driven me out. We did not know the extent to which Jonah's past, an entanglement with the woman who had left his children, would complicate a fragile kinship. We only knew we had chosen a beginning, and that in a world of leather and oaths, choosing someone like me could be an act of war or a miracle. The diner clock ticked toward midnight. The kids sprawled in a fitful peace on the couch, and the smell of stew promised warmth. The question was no longer whether we deserved it. The question was whether the world we belonged to would let us try. The first time a Halos man made it personal, Jonah didn't answer with a fist. He answered with the softest kind of refusal, his back to them, his arms full of a small girl who had torn her dress, singing nonsense syllables until the trembling in his hands steadied. The Halos men parked their bikes in a neat, predatory line across from his trailer, engines idling like throats clearing, and a lean man with Lucas eyes, only younger, hungry, the look of someone raised to take, walked up and asked if he knew the cost of harboring what their president had discarded. Jonah listened while the children shrank behind him, fingers intertwining like prayer beads. Miguel stood a little taller, jaw set, as if by force of will he could shoulder the world away. The twins watched the movement of faces like two small anchors, cataloging expressions for danger later. The toddler clutched her rabbit and closed one eye against the sun of trouble. Jonah kept his face even. He put the little girl down and dusted her dress as if it were just a spill, and when he spoke, his voice was that quiet current that had drawn me in before I even knew how thirsty I was. "We feed what needs feeding," he said. "You can take the lecture back to wherever you keep your sense of entitlement." The lean man laughed, brittle and false, and the laugh slid between Jonah's ribs in a way that made something inside him fold. "You know how this looks, Reyes," he said. "The Halos look after their own. You siding with people who need a roof?" Jonah cut in. "Are you telling me the Halos answer charity with a ledger?" The man's smile sharpened. "We're protectors of legacy. We keep the line." "Legacy doesn't keep children from sleeping in a trailer," Jonah said. "It doesn't teach a child how to tie a shoelace or how to stop a nosebleed in the middle of the night. It doesn't make food where there's none." It was the rawness of Jonah's voice that made a pause. The man from the Halos favored him with a look that meant calculation. "You think you're noble," he said. "Noble doesn't keep you from getting crushed when the road gets rough. You owe your brothers a show of loyalty, Reyes. Softness is contagious." "Maybe softness is what keeps us human," Jonah answered. "It wasn't a challenge to the club. It wasn't a pledge. It was a small, defiant claim of the kind of man he was." The Halos man left a card on Jonah's table, like a talisman, an invitation or a threat dressed as courtesy. No violence that night, only presence, the deliberate, quiet monitoring that precedes bruises. After they left, the kids clustered like a living fort around Jonah. Miguel grabbed his father's arm, voice rougher than his years. "They gonna make us leave?" he asked. "No," Jonah said, though his throat tightened. "Not if I can help it." He looked at me then, as if asking permission to be more than the man who kept the engine running. I saw the calculus in his eyes, the kids, his honor, his chapter. He carried the answer to those weights like a secret, and then he opened his palms and let me hold some of the load. From then on, the first obstacle always arrived wearing the guise of propriety, a market that refused to sell tire patches to Jonah's chapter. An employment opportunity evaporated for one of the teenagers the Halos whispered into class as an example of what happens when you choose soft company. Jonah's chapter, smaller, undersupplied, began to fray at the edges, as men were reminded how easy it was to slip back into the old order by doing what was expected. Jonah, for all his quiet, was a man who understood how brotherhood functioned, and the way that understanding made decisions always felt like stepping over hot coals. One evening, a prospect in Jonah's chapter, Eddie, came to the trailer drunk on bravado and resentment. He'd been tutored by the Halos in small cruelties, the way a joke has teeth, the way exclusion binds like rope. He swaggered into the kitchen where Jonah was teaching the twins to peel potatoes and tossed a beer bottle onto the table. "You sure you want to keep her around?" Eddie slurred, eyes flicking to me. The twins went still, the room tightening around Eddie's insolence. "A hanger-on like that brings heat. Halos don't forget slight." "She's not a hanger-on," Jonah said, voice low with a patience that coiled. "She's family. She helps. She can't give you what's needed," Eddie cut in with the club's language, the sanctioned vocabulary of bloodlines, legacy, and value. "Think of what this looks like. Lucas will like that less." The word Lucas landed in the room like a stone. Jonah's hands trembled, one thumb rubbing a rhythm into the wood. "Lucas isn't deciding my life," Jonah said, and there was steel under the velvet. Eddie's smirk cracked like old paint. He went on because small men are loud when they feel overlooked. Threats wrapped in club sense, warnings disguised as loyalty. He left with the kind of chuckle that's meant to unsettle. The night didn't explode, it accumulated. The sabotage was slow and mean. A bolt missing when Jonah needed to fix a bike, a batch of tainted parts, a late-night confrontation in which Lucas himself came not with fury, but with a judgment wrapped in an uncomfortable softness. He approached the trailer with a presence that filled the yard. The kids watched him like they were watching weather change. "Maya?" Lucas said, stopping just beneath the porch light, the word hanging as if he could plant it and it would root. Ownership, memory, the thing he had tried to erase. "You chose to stay in the territory. You chose—" "I chose a table," I said, and even as I said it, my voice betrayed the fear knotted under bone. "I chose to feed and be fed. If that makes me dangerous in your book, then what does that make you? The man who told me I was less?" Lucas's face didn't burn. It was cool and traveled like a coin across the table, scanning. "You know how this works," he said. "Choices have consequences." My chest felt the age of a ledger again, lines scored like old debts. Lucas looked at the children, and his eyes flickered, then hardened. "You're smart, Maya. Don't corrupt him. Don't corrupt them." There was an almost mocking tenderness in the way he said it, as if he mourned for a future that could never be tarnished by softness. That night, Jonas sat on the edge of the bed in the trailer, and I watched him from the doorway. He was a man who had been built to carry other people's needs, and yet the burden of carrying his own decisions squatted like a weight at his feet. He left his palm on the mattress and closed his eyes. "He's trying to make us choose by making it costly to be kind," Jonas said. His voice was cracked with a tiredness that felt biblical. "My club will be tested." "Then you have to tell them what's at stake," I said before I knew I would. "Tell them you choose us or don't. Don't let them decide for you." He turned and smiled like a small private forgiveness. "If it were that easy," he said, and there was a humorless kind of ache in it. He told me that afternoon he had been raised by men who taught him to read a road the way others read scripture. He had been taught the art of loyalty like a craft. To break that craft would mark him. To choose us would mark him further. We tried small resistances first. Jonah held a chapter meeting and spoke like a man revealing a map that had always been his. He didn't rant about sentimentality. He spoke about the kids as facts, about bills paid and scraped knees and the fidelity of feeding people. The men listened. Some nodded, some scrubbed their faces against the harshness of new thought. Some left the room and spat words that would be used later as fuel. Yet the press grew. Shots were fired near the trailer one night, meant to intimidate. Bullets in the dirt that shattered a window of the trailer but missed the little bodies inside. The children woke with the sense that the world had shifted and did not understand the language of adult fights. Jonah found me on the porch, breath visible like a prayer into the cold. "They missed them," he said simply, and his voice didn't tremble. "They missed them, and they wanted me to feel it." "I should have left," I blurted. Shame rose so hot I could taste metal. "If my being here brings down—" "You didn't bring it down," Jonah said, and his hands were warm and full of apology, an apology that didn't ask for absolution. They chose to act on it. "You're not a storm, Maya. You're a person." The kids, for their part, adapted to fear the way they adapt to rain, with a certain resourcefulness. Miguel became the night watch. Lucia developed a sudden attention to small noises. They learned to count bike engines in the night as if playing a game. And the two toddlers hummed songs they had heard in the kitchen. Their resilience was a small, stubborn sun that warmed our trailer's brittle winter. The pull of Jonah's offer, family, warmth, a different kind of claim, drew me closer even as the push of danger pressed on the edges. I found myself lying awake, thinking how I would answer if Jonah asked me to make his choice with him. How would I fit into a life that required not only my love, but my willingness to face down a man who had once been my world? In the half-sleep, I rehearsed conversations that might never happen, and practiced the sound of my name being called in their home as a title that meant belonging and not just pity. Then, in the quietness of possibility, Jonah stepped closer. He told me his chapter had offered him a choice: demotion to prospect if he refused to comply with certain territorial expectations, or a quiet, suffocating conformity in exchange for safety. He had decided to step away from the fold if necessary, to risk being cast out. "If I lose them," he said, "I still have the children. I still have you. I can build from nothing." "Don't do it for me," I whispered. There was steel in the plea, the kind that meant both of us might be devoured if we traded ourselves for martyrdom. "Do it because it's who you are." He met my eyes, and there was a tenderness in him that felt like the promise of a new grammar. "I am not who I used to be," he said. "I want a man who can be both gentle and brave. Maybe that's against protocol, maybe it's an offense, but I don't want to look back and see an empty trailer and know I chose to keep my uniform over my heart." That night, as the little body slept with dreams that smelled like pancakes and motor oil, Jonah and I made a ferocious, fragile plan. We would not hide. We would not pretend. We would document the children's lives, records at the school, neighbors who could testify, community members who had seen Jonah fold his uniform into a life of ordinary care. We would inoculate the story of us from being simply a rumor. We began building an armor that looked like paperwork and calls, like friends who would stand witness. But armor only goes so far against a man who has ruled by perception and power. The push and pull tightened, a muscle flexing before a tear. Each concession Jonah's chapter made to keep the peace bent them closer to the halo's shape. Each act of kindness we gave became a target for their disdain. My shame, inculcated, reiterated, polished by a man who called himself a leader, rose like a tide that sought to drown us. And yet, every time Jonah sang a lullaby to a toddler with a scraped knee, or Miguel taught me how to check a tire so it wouldn't explode on a road where help might be miles away, or Lucia tucked my hair behind my ear as if she knew the shape of my hurt and refused to let it be bigger than her, I believed, in tiny doses, that defiance could be tender, that kindness could be revolutionary. We did not yet know whether kindness could outlast a club's fury. We only knew what love looked like in the small: a plate of stew, a hand on a forehead, the steady burning of a porch light left on for a child's return. The first time Jonah's past arrived like a loaded guest, it came by way of a postcard someone had shoved under the trailer step at dawn. He found it with his coffee still warm in his hands, reading the neat, looping handwriting that wasn't his child's. The name on the front made his stomach do the thing it always did when the folder of old hurts was opened. It clenched and released into a longing he had kept folded up for years. She'd written sometimes, once or twice, months stitched between salutes and apologies. Then the letter stopped. The postcard simply said, "Come find me." There was an address, a town 3 hours north, a place with a ferry and a loneliness that smelled of salt. He put the card in his pocket and didn't tell anyone. He didn't need to say the name. The kitchen fell silent as if the word would fracture something fragile. The kids kept asking the small, ordinary questions of children. Did she send money? Did she say she was coming home? And Jonah answered with the economy of a man who had learned to ration hope. He had told them, once, that their mother had gone to look for herself. It was a blank, tidy explanation for a hole that had no easy shape. The truth was jagged. He had loved a woman who had been restless in a way that swallowed promises. And she had left without explanation the day the twins were a month old. He had followed her away on a road that offered nothing but an instinct to care. And then he'd returned with 5 small reasons to stay behind, and half a severed heart he refused to name. When he finally went north, he left with the kids' pictures in his wallet and a helmet on his arm. He told me he was going for answers, and left the rest unspoken. The way men in that world leave is often proof enough of the seriousness. He was gone for 2 days, and the silence made the trailer small. I found myself listening for the cadence of his footsteps, replaying conversations to find meaning in what had been left unsaid. He came back late, with grease under his nails and a face the color of a man who'd been dragged through place and come out different. His hands were steady, though, and when he spoke, the words were measured. She hadn't been where the postcard had said. The address belonged to an old lover of hers who had moved away, a dead end. He had walked the ferry docks and asked about a woman with her name. People had shrugged. There were always too many women with their names. Someone at a bar knew a rumor and refused to trade it for a drink. "What did you want to hear?" I asked, voice small as a match. My curiosity was a dangerous thing. Seeking answers had once led me straight into a man's judgment. "That should come back," Jonah said, and his eyes caught mine like a plea. "That should tell me why she left. That should say she was sorry." He closed his mouth, and the admission looked like a tender wound. But there was nothing, just the echo of her name. The absence became another kind of presence. Through the weeks that followed, rejections came more frequent and sharper in design. Lucas, sensing an opening, began to shift tactics from intimidation to undermining. He started whispering to Jonah's chapter that their vice president was being distracted by sentimental attachments, that his focus on family would make him soft in the one place a biker's backbone should remain iron, in territory and in loyalty. Prospects who wanted to climb ranks began to show Jonah the teeth they'd been taught, reminding him in jests and in pointed silences that mercy had a cost. Then, a secret Jonah had kept, one he thought would never surface, was unraveled by a man who used truth like a club. Eddie, drunk and eager to earn favor, overheard a conversation between Jonah and a friend in which Jonah had admitted to tracking down a woman he thought might be their children's mother. Jonah had said, in the deceptive privacy of comradeship, that he had even once been tempted to track her down across states. Eddie took it back to the Halos like a pledge, and Lucas made sure the detail traveled with a particular inflection. Jonah had been stalking. The story grew teeth. It was told in a tone that implied madness and danger. The club's gossip took on a life of its own. Men who never knew Jonah's steadiness repeated rumors, and each repetition sharpened perception into accusation. People began to question whether Jonah's guardianship of the kids was as clean as he'd presented it. Hushed conversations suggested a father who couldn't keep his house in order, who might be unstable because of his obsession, who might one day slip and ruin the children's lives because he couldn't control himself. Lucas whispered that concern like a mercy note, but it was a wedge he was sliding between Jonah and his chapter. When the chapter called a meeting to review leadership priorities, the room smelled of cheap coffee and colder things. Judgment. Jonah stood straight and let the gravity of his roles be weighed in the balance. He spoke of the children's school records, of the names of neighbors who would vouch for nurse visits, and for how Jonah had never missed a PTA meeting even when the chapter expected him for a ride. He opened his palms and offered receipts and bus schedules and a portfolio of everyday proof that this was not a man unmoored. It didn't stop the barbs. Eddie accused him of being soft. Some men said quietly that a leader needed to be above such attachments, that a man who prioritized family would be less inclined to hold when a chapter needed iron. "We need men who will close ranks," someone intoned, as if kindness were a fissure. A vote was taken, not openly, but in the quiet way of chapters that have rules that mean bone. Jonah was stripped of a title, reassigned to prospect under the guise of retraining, a humiliation meant to warn others. The children were told that their father had work commitments that would take him more often away, and that they'd have to learn to rely on the trailer and on each other. The little fort they had been built into a structure with holes. When Jonah came home that night, he moved through a fog of shame that could have been anger if you'd seen only the surface. He folded his jacket with slow, precise motions and sat at the table. The kids watched him like they'd seen him naked. "They demoted me," he said, without looking at anyone in particular. "They said I need to remember my place." Miguel's jaw worked. "Are they mad we exist?" he asked, the simplicity of the question like a blade. The twins clung to the rabbit, murmurings of hurt pressed into their small bodies. The 3-year-old poked at the stew absent-mindedly, not understanding yet how politics could make a home feel unsafe. I wanted to tell Jonah that we'd fight, that demotion meant nothing when a family had to be defended. But I knew clubs had their machinery. A man stripped of rank could be ostracized, refused supplies, cut off from contracts. He could be exposed to the kind of poverty that makes people desperate, and desperation turns men towards choices that destroy more than territory. I also knew, I had seen, the way Lucas enjoyed being the man with the blade in his hand, trimming any foliage that threatened the shape of his world. "It wasn't because you couldn't lead," I said finally. "It was punishment for choosing to lead differently." He looked at me then, his face made sudden and raw. "They gave me an ultimatum," Jonah said. "Abide, return to the old order, and we keep a place in the chapter. Resist, and well, we'll be painted as traitors. They'll starve us out in the name of keeping clean. They'll make our children into symbols of failure." He closed his eyes, and the room hummed with a menace that wasn't only outside us. A fracture had opened inside Jonah, the kind that forms when a man must break a promise to others to keep a promise to himself and his children. "Tell them to make of me what they will," I said, truth soft and dangerous. "But don't let them decide what kind of father you are." His laugh was a small, bitter thing. "They made that choice before," he said. "When they decided lineage mattered more than care, the choice was made." The days after the demotion were thin. Pockets of support emerged. Neighbors who left casseroles, a teacher who vouched for Miguel's steady improvement, a vendor who quietly kept giving Jonah credit. But the halo's pressure found new ways to suffocate. A parked truck across the street manned by men who never smiled. A bank call that flagged a line of credit needing reevaluation. Small assassinations of stability, each designed to teach Jonah that gentleness carries a price. Then the most dangerous fracture of all appeared, a hidden truth about Lucas. In the privacy of a late-night shift at the diner, a man who had once been close to Lucas sat across from me with shaking hands and the smell of regret. He told me something I had not suspected, something that split open the story I had held about my own past. Lucas, he whispered, had not always known my fertility status. The word that had been used, the label, had been wielded like a weapon, not offered like a diagnosis. He wanted to control the narrative, the man said. Sometimes leaders make choices to save face. He lied. I felt the floor fall away. Not because the truth altered what Lucas had done. He had still spoken the words that sent me away, but because the knowledge reframed those words as choice and not fate. Lucas's cruelty became less a law and more an act. Someone had decided my life was expendable in the currency of club politics. The club had made a theater in which my body was a prop. When I told Jonah, the look on his face was hard and surprised, as if a map had been redrawn without his consent. "Why tell me now?" he asked. "Why keep it hidden?" "Maybe he wanted me to leave without him having to own the blame," I said. "Maybe he thought an absence would be easier than a scandal. Or maybe he thought I'd be easier to hold if I were barren, less likely to bring sons that might be used to press power." Jonah's jaw tightened. The room filled with the raw geometry of revenge and protection. He stood up as if pulled by a magnet. "Then that lie is a weapon," he said, "and weapons get used on people like us." We were no longer only two people in a trailer. We were a target and its defense. The revelation did not heal the old wound. It fanned it. It made Lucas' betrayal a thing with more gravity, and the choice before Jonah heavier. He could fight it in the open and risk all of them, or he could fold and accept defeat. The chapter's votes and the Halo's whispers would keep finding new ways to cut. That night, the children slept with an uneasy peace. Lights in the trailer were low. Our talk was a small, insistent tending of what we might become. Secrets had been exposed, and fractures were real and sharp. Men would choose sides now with more clarity. Loyalties would be tested and possibly broken. The question waiting on the porch of morning was whether love could survive being made into a political act. I reached for Jonah's hand across the table. It trembled under mine, not from fear alone, but from the weight of what he must now shoulder. "We can make our own legacy," I whispered, "a brave thing or a desperate one, not one built on bloodline, but on the claiming of care." He squeezed back hard. "Then we'll be the kind of rebels who feed the world back to the people who live in it," he said. "If they want a war, they'll have to start one against my kids." The decision hung between us like an unstruck match. The fallout would come, and it would be loud. But in the stillness of that moment, with the trailer smelling of stew and old leather, we chose each other, and the five who had already claimed us. And that choosing cracked something open in a place that had been taught to keep brittle and small. The fracture would change everything. And in the blow's echo, we would find out whether what we had could be reshaped into something that could survive the storm. Jonah left in the morning with the kids pressed to his chest and the trailer door slamming like an oath behind him. He took the long road to Lucas's clubhouse because he said we needed to end the story in the place it had begun. He did not go with fists bristling for blood. He went with a ledger of proofs, with school records and neighbor testimonies folded into a binder, and with something far riskier, a demand for dignity that smelled faintly of desperation and wholly of love. Word traveled fast the other way, too. Lucas, who had trimmed my life to a single cruel sentence, now smelled the possibility of being called out, of his lie being exposed to the gravity of a man who would not be silenced. What followed was a meeting assembled like a tribunal, chrome and leather under a low, impatient sky, and a gamble that could either make Jonah's life whole or break every thin thing he had rescued. When Jonah stepped into their yard, his face was the map of a man who had been up all night deciding whether to keep his children or to keep his ranking. He carried Miguel by the hand and held Lucia's small shoulder in a way that said he would not let anyone pry them loose. The halos circled like vultures in polite clothes. Lucas sat the way a king sits when he believes his throne is carved by his will alone. And when his eyes found mine, there was a balance of triumph and calculation. He had expected fear to curve my spine, to see me shrink into apology. Instead, I walked beside Jonah, the little fork from my mother in my pocket, like a talisman that remembered food, not power. I was no longer asking for permission to exist. Jonah cleared his throat and spoke with a clarity that steadied him and cut through the room's thick complacency. He did not scream, he did not beg. He told them the facts. The kids' attendance, the bills he paid on time, the neighbors who could testify that he'd been a pillar, not a liability. He let them hear how he had found the postcard and followed the trail like a man hunting closure, not a predator stalking prey. When Lucas tried to slide the old label across the table, why keep someone marked? Jonah pushed the binder forward like a gauntlet. "This," he said, "is proof that my family does not belong to your ledger. They belong to me." Eddie laughed in a small, brittle way, all teeth and relief at an actor's part. But Miguel stepped forward and said with the small authority only children can wield, "You don't get to make our house empty. You don't get to say who we are." The audacity of a 9-year-old demanding dignity became an arrow. The room shifted. Men who had practiced intimidation watched a small human being strip their theater of power, and for a sliver of a second, they saw themselves reflected as petty and mean. Lucas altered his face into something calmer. He offered a conditional mercy. Jonah could keep the kids if he stepped back further into the chapter and accepted stricter oversight. It was a bargain that meant servitude. It was an invitation to shrink. Jonah could have accepted. He might have taken survival for his family over the risk of dignity. But the thing that had been built in the trailer, the table we had spoken of, was not worth half measures. He looked at me with a ferocity I had come to know. Gentle, patient, then all at once immovable. "No," he said, "we won't be punished for kindness. We are not for sale to your conveniences." He knew what he would lose by defying them. Supplies, work contracts, perhaps even the kinship that had kept him fed in harder winters. He also knew what he would lose by capitulating. His children's sense of safety, our claim to a home that was not leased on someone else's terms. Lucas responded with the only weapon he had not yet displayed, a public humiliation staged to look like discipline. He signaled a prospect, and men moved to take Jonah's bike for inspection. It was a minor theft compared to what could be done, but the message was clear. Jonah did not lunge. He watched the world tilt and then did something that stunned everyone who had cataloged him as soft. He reached into his jacket and took out his club patch, the symbol of his chapter, and placed it on the table in front of the halos, like a sacrifice. Men flinched. Removing a patch is an unthinkable self-exile among brothers. It is a stripping of identity in a culture where leather and insignia are anchors. He was offering them what they craved, the compliance of a man who would yield his badge. The room inhaled. I felt the sound as a physical thing. Jonah's hand steadied as he spoke the words that would become the hinge of our lives. "I renounce my patch," he said, "not because I am broken, but because my children are not collateral. Keep your legacy, Lucas. I will carry a different one home." Silence followed, a vacuum in which the world could not decide whether to applaud or to grind him to pulp. Lucas's eyes were a landmine of betrayals. He had expected to push Jonah into a corner and watch him fold like cheap metal. Instead, Jonah had performed a sacrifice that rewired the room. He gave up his rank so his children could keep their home. He chose exile over complicity, family over hierarchy. And in that choice, there was a kind of purity that the halos had no language to punish without losing their own image. Immediately, cost and consequence collided. Some men scoffed. Others nodded, moved by something beyond politics. This is what loyalty had looked like before the clubs became kingdoms. Jonah's chapter, surprised and leaderless, splintered. Prospects who had sought to climb by cruelty slunk away to more profitable alliances. Supplies dried up where contracts were cut by men who preferred compliance to conscience. We lost certain securities that night, and with each loss came the sharp taste of fear. But we also gained something that could not be taxed, The right to tell our children that their father had chosen them over the club, and that their mother had chosen to stand and witness it. Lucas, for his part, could not muster the simple cruelty that would have made him a villain in the storybook sense. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and offered a final, quiet threat. "You will regret this," he said, soft as a closing lid. Jonah did not answer. He had already gathered the children into his arms and turned his back on a yard full of men who would measure worth by lineage and by leather. He walked away from the chapter and toward us, toward a life that would be harder on paper but softer in the bones. The first night after Jonah gave up his patch, we sat outside the trailer on overturned crates, the children's heads leaning against our knees as if they had finally been allowed to rest. The sky hung low and clear, a map of indifferent stars. Miguel balanced a screwdriver on his knee and looked at Jonah like a man who had discovered heroism in the flesh. "You did right," he said simply. Jonah smiled, half smile, weathered and honest. "I did what I had to," he replied, and the gravity of that admission was a benediction. He reached for my hand, and the touch between us was an agreement made of small, stubborn promises. We would face the ways the world punished difference. We would take blows and count them against our capacity to hold each other. He had given up his standing to protect our home. I realized with a kind of dizzy gratitude that his sacrifice was not a surrender, but a claiming. He had carved a new territory with something softer than a blade, a determination to protect those he loved. Word spread, and not all of it hostile. Neighbors who had once watched from the periphery now offered spare parts and odd jobs. A teacher rallied to find after-school support for the kids, and a local mechanic offered discounted parts if Jonah would teach apprentices in the mornings. The community's small kindnesses stitched some of our losses back together in ways the clubs could not anticipate. In the margin of hardship, we began to build a life that belonged to us, a life that redefined legacy not as bloodline, but as the choices you make when everything else demands obedience. There were nights of bitter scarcity, one winter where the trailer's heater died and we ate canned beans by headlamp. But there were also mornings when the children ran out with cheeks flushed from sleep and declared the world good because their father had told them so. Those mornings became our currency. Jonah's sacrifice had cost him a uniform and the convenience of protection, but it had given us something that no club could confiscate, a story we could tell with pride. We had lost garments of authority and gained the right to patch our own wounds. The most tender moment of that difficult year came, unexpectedly, in a county courthouse where Jonah signed the papers that would make him guardian in full legal name, relinquishing nothing of his heart but claiming everything for the 5 small people who called him Papa. He had fought with a bureaucrat who misread leatherless men as aimless, and when he emerged, hands ink-stained and exhausted, he held our legal right to be a family like a trophy. The clerk had asked why he had chosen to go through with it. Why not rely on informal arrangements? And he had answered simply, "Because names matter. They make you real when people try to tell you you're not." When he walked back to the trailer clutching those papers, the kids swarmed him as if he had returned from war. He set them on the table and opened his palms. "Now," he said, voice thick with laughter and something like salvation, "we are official outlaws of a different sort, the ones who break codes to keep people whole." There remained threats. Lucas watched like a patient wolf waiting for a winter to break a man's back. He probed our vulnerabilities with the slow cruelty of someone used to authority. He also found his lie, his careful lie, lifted like a veil and exposed to the light. The halos could twist and punish, but they could not unmake the legal papers or the neighborhood goodwill that had begun to gather around our trailer like a fence. Jonah had paid with his patch, and his sacrifice had been a contagion of courage. It taught the people closest to him that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is to refuse to be brutal in the name of tradition. As for me, I stopped carrying the old ledger of shame in my chest. Lucas's lie no longer defined what I might be. It was evidence of a man who feared softness enough to weaponize it. Jonah's sacrifice rewrote the contract between us. He had given up the easy safety of his club to guarantee a shelter for the 5 lives he had promised to protect, and for the woman who had chosen to stand at his side. His act was my redemption and his own claims simultaneously. It was a romantic sacrifice in the rawest sense, a public giving up that made private love possible. In that season of loss and small triumphs, we built a table, scratched, uneven, made of reclaimed wood from an old barn, and we set it under the low-hung kitchen light. The kids sat in mismatched chairs. Jonah carved lines into the surface with his knife, as if naming the hours we'd survived. I served stew we had scraped together and handed out forks, and when he reached for my hand under the table, his fingers were steady and warm. Around us were the scars of choices and the bright, unruly proof of what we had saved. Lucas watched from his territory, maybe surprised that the world had not collapsed into his chosen order. Maybe he was plotting a new cruelty. It didn't matter as much anymore, because in the space Jonah had made, by surrendering his patch and taking up parenthood as a form of sacrament, we had given our children something better than legacy. We gave them the truth that love could be stronger than lineage, louder than rumor, and firmer than any charted claim. The day we formally made our family legal, Jonah knelt in front of the kids.